Scripture for the message is in Luke 23, verses 1 through 25. Then the whole company of the Jewish leaders arose and brought Jesus before Pilate. They began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man misleading our nation, forbidding us from giving tax to Caesar, and saying that he himself is a king, a Christ." The Pilate asked him, "You are king of the Jews?" He answered him, "You said so." Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no guilt in this man." But they were urgent, saying, "He stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea from Galilee even to this place." Now when Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. When he had heard that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him over to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at that time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had long desired to see him, because he had heard about him. He was hoping to see some sign done by him. So he questioned him at some length, but Jesus made no answer. The chief priest and the scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him. Herod with his soldiers treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then, arraying him in splendid clothing, he was sent back to Pilate. Herod and Pilate became friends with each other that very day. Before this, they had been at enmity with each other. Pilate then called together the chief priests and the rulers and the people, and he said to them, "You brought this man to me as one who was misleading the people. And after examining him before you, behold, I did not find this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither did Herod, for he sent him back to us. Look, nothing deserving of death has been done by him. I will therefore punish and release him." But they all cried out together, "Away with this man! Release to us Barabbas," a man who had been thrown into prison for an insurrection started in the city and for murder. Pilate addressed them once more, desiring to release Jesus, but they kept shouting, "Crucify! Crucify him!" A third time he said to them, "Why? What evil has he done? I found in him no guilt deserving of death. I will therefore punish and release him." But they were urgent, demanding with loud cries that he should be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate decided that their demand should be granted. He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, for whom they asked, but he delivered Jesus over to their will. May God bless the reading of his word. When we're treated unjustly, we're tempted to complain, to say to everyone that we can, we don't deserve to be treated like this. And maybe we'd even be tempted to act unjustly in return for the one who first did something to us. Charles Wesley wrote a hymn that he titled, with a strange name, "A Victim Divine." What that means, I think, is Jesus didn't do anything deserving of death, so on one hand he's a victim, and yet as divine, he willingly became the face of injustice, which means he let himself be treated as a criminal and suffer undeserved consequences that went with being a criminal. All this he did as an act of love for us. This distinguishes Jesus' reaction to injustice from all others. He didn't try to defend himself, but simply acted out of love for others. And the hard part is we, as his disciples, are supposed to witness that love when we're being treated unjustly. That's the challenge that our text has for us today. In this text, there's a long series of injustices going on. First, the Jewish leaders bring Jesus before the Roman governor, Pilate, and they lie about what he's done. He's misleading our people. He's stopping people from giving taxes to Caesar. He's calling himself the king. All of those are lies. Now, Pilate quickly sees that Jesus isn't guilty of any of these things that he's being accused of. The leaders don't like hearing Pilate say that, and so they say he incites the people to riot, in other words, from Galilee to Judea. Now, when Pilate heard that Jesus had been from Galilee, he sends him off to Herod. And Herod, we're told, rejoiced exceedingly because he had heard about all these signs this man had did, and he hoped to be able to see one. So he questions Jesus thoroughly, hoping that somewhere along the way Jesus is just going to stop and do some kind of miraculous sign of some kind. But Jesus said and did nothing. This allowed the leaders at this time who came along to be hurling accusations at Jesus. And Herod's soldiers started to mock him. They put an expensive garment on him as if he would be royalty when they think, of course, that he's not. They send him back to Pilate. Pilate gathers together the leaders and all the people. And he said, well, Jesus isn't guilty of anything, so I will beat him just because you don't like him, and then I will release him. But the crowd yelled, take him away. Release for us Barabbas. Someone who actually had been part of a riot and who had murdered someone during that riot. A second time, Pilate talked about releasing Jesus, and so the crowd started yelling, crucify, crucify. A third time, he said, for what crime? We're told they yelled louder, and their voices prevailed. A murderer was freed, and Jesus was handed over to death. And we're told that was the will of the people. There's so much injustice in all of this. Nothing deserving of death was discovered or found or proved by anyone. Roman, Jew, common people, leaders, no one could show in any way that he deserved anything like death. All that were brought forward were lies and a kind of mass force trying to insist that just because we wanted enough, it should be done. And that did prevail. All this amounted to freeing a murderer and condemning an innocent man. So it was injustice. He was a victim. And yet, we know from looking back that Jesus took all of this on himself willingly as an act of love. He became the face of injustice in order to take injustice from our hearts forever. And we, as his disciples, when we're treated unjustly, are supposed to be witnesses to the kind of love Jesus showed to the world. Let's unpack this with an example from Bob Robertson, who found himself trying to wrestle with a different approach to injustice than the common one we all do, of just saying this is wrong. He said it all started in November 2007. His wife Jessica got news that her father had been diagnosed with advanced lung and brain cancer. They traveled quickly to be at his side. After they spent the day at the hospital, they went back to the parents' house and were staying overnight. Jessica got up in the middle of the night in order to get a glass of water. Bob heard a noise and then heard her calling for him. He went in and found her lying on the kitchen floor. I can't move, she said. Called 911. They went to the emergency room. It was in a small enough town. They needed to get her in a helicopter to a larger city with a bigger hospital. And there he heard one of the doctors use the word quadriplegic. Bob's head was spinning at this time. She's a healthy 56-year-old woman. How could she be paralyzed from just wanting to get a drink of water in the middle of the night? In his soul, he was arguing. Jess doesn't deserve this. Everyone loved her. She's a sweet, giving person, The only reason she was even here is because she wanted to care for her dad. Everything about this is just wrong. So at first he's getting that common reaction we're all tempted to. Injustice, wrong. Hours turned into days, and a friend from their home church back home got him a motel room so he could be closer to the hospital to see her. That was the first sign of something different maybe going on than just injustice. Days turned into weeks, he said, and weeks into months. Jessica's father died, and yet she was too heavily medicated to even understand this at the time. Eventually, she was moved to a hospital that was only an hour away from their house, but she still couldn't sit up, and she was only lucid at times. It was during one of those times that she said to Bob, I asked God if every 15 minutes he would let something good happen to someone to remind us that he's with us. He thought that's just like her to be this selfless, and yet that selflessness also made him mad. How could God let this happen to her? Well, 2 months later, she was able to come home, but she was far from well. In fact, when she did first get home, she said, we need to have a talk. So Bob sat down next to her, and he said that she wanted him to divorce her and put her into a nursing home. This isn't fair to you, Bob. I may never walk or use my arms or hands again. I want you to live your life. He was taken aback by all this, and he could only say, I am living my life. You are my life. They developed a routine over the next days. A caregiver would come in 5 days a week, and then on Saturday, quite a few of her lady friends from church would come and take turns working her muscles and joints, trying to be able to get some kind of a movement for her. And eventually she was able to start moving her arms again. And she immediately started doing needlework so she could make gifts for others. And most of Bob's check went for the caregiver, so he decided to retire early, and he took over those caregiving duties. And yet, during this time, he was still basically praying, God, let her get back to normal. Well, part of the caregiving was to read the Bible and do devotions together. They even went through that hard book of Job, trying to understand suffering a little more and trying to develop a better attitude in the midst of it. Yet one day he remembered that he was taking her to church, and they had a ramp going up to the front, and it was raining outside, and he slipped and started to fall, and the wheelchair started to go back, and he had to grab it and just lunge for it, and he scraped his knee very hard. And he said he was so mad at the time. Didn't God recognize I was taking my paralyzed wife to church? Not only is he not rewarding me, he seems to be punishing me for doing that. But slowly, Bob was learning more and more of a suffering Jesus who bore injustice willingly. So that helped him to get better at caregiving. He still had setbacks. He remembered one incident. He said, well, she was getting more and more medical bills, money was tighter. She had been getting her hair done with her hairdresser that she had known for years, twice a week. And Bob told this hairdresser they wouldn't be able to come anymore. And the hairdresser volunteered to teach Bob how to do her hair. The first reaction is, no, that's a step too far. I'm not going to do it at all. And especially when he heard all that was involved in that. He said you not only have to wash the hair, you put in a thickening product, which I'm not sure what that is, and then curling gel, and then rollers, you blow dry it, and then when you've got the rollers out, you put this zigzag part into it. And he had never heard of a part that wasn't straight, so he had no idea how to do anything like this. All he could tell the hairdresser was, "I shouldn't have to do this." And the hairdresser responded, "But you are able to do this. You can do this." Bob thought more about Jesus and his suffering and how that suffering was undeserved. He'd already led Bob to do so much for his wife. "He'd been with me every step of the way," he said. So the long and short of it is he got good at hairdressing. So good that his wife would brag when those friends came over to work her muscles and joints, and said that she would kiddingly brag that, "I've got the best hairdresser." Maybe you've heard of him. His name's Mr. Bobby. In the face of injustice, we're called to show people Jesus' love. We're tempted to complain, "I don't deserve this." But that's not what Jesus did. He willingly took on the face of injustice, being considered a criminal, all out of love for us, to take injustice from our hearts forever. So when injustice raises its head in our lives, let us show others Jesus, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, a man who was willing to suffer for all in order to cleanse us from every sin.